Egypt, the art of getting from here to there. Moving things around is hard, really hard. Anyone who has ever rowed a boat or paddled a canoe in a place where you had to make a portage can quite enthusiastically tell you how much easier it is to move stuff around on water than on land. But have you ever thought about just how much easier it is? In the early 19th century, Farmer Smith had a small but productive apple orchard in upstate New York. Every fall, he loaded his horse Tobias with 250 pounds of apples for market, which was all that Tobias could carry over the pass that snaked through upstate New York's hilly terrain. Farmer Smith's apples were very popular. He did well, saved his money, and planted more apple trees. In a few years, Farmer Smith had done well enough to afford a cart to transport his harvest, and with Tobias strapped in, he could now take 2,000 pounds of apples to market with each cartload. Years passed, the weather held, and Farmer Smith's apples continued to sell. With his proceeds, he bought more acres of land and planted more apple trees. By the fall of 1825, Farmer Smith was in luck. The long-awaited Erie Canal was finally finished and open for business. Tobias had long since been put out to pasture, so Farmer Smith roped his new horse, Jedediah, to the barge he'd rented in Albany. Jedediah was able to pull 30 tons of apples all the way across the state to Buffalo, where the Erie Canal ended and Lake Erie began. And thanks to the waterways of Lake Erie, Farmer Smith could now sell his apples as far away as Detroit. Almost 2 centuries later, the proportions in the above example have barely budged. In fact, all that's changed is that horsepower has been replaced with horsepower. Modern container ships can transport goods for about net 17 cents per container mile, compared to semi-trailer trucks that do it for net $2.40, including the cost of the locomotion mode as well as operating costs in both instances. But even this incredible disparity in cost assumes access to an American-style multi-line highway, the sort that simply doesn't exist in some 95% of the planet. It also assumes that the road cargo is all transported by semi rather than less efficient vehicles like those UPS trucks that probably brought you this book. It certainly ignores your family car. It also does not consider the cost and maintenance of the medium of transport itself. The U.S. interstate highway system, for example, responsible for only 1/4 of the United States' road traffic by miles driven, has an annual maintenance cost of $160 billion. By contrast, the Army Corps of Engineers' 2014 budget for all U.S. waterways maintenance is only $2.7 billion, while the oceans are flat out free. Toss in associated costs ranging from the $100 billion Americans spend annually on car insurance to the $130 billion needed to build America's 110,000 service stations to the global supply chain needed to manufacture and service road vehicles, and the practical ratio of road to water transport inflates to anywhere from 40-to-1 in populated flatlands to in excess of 70-to-1 in sparsely populated highlands. Cheap, easy transport does 2 things for you. First, it makes you a lot of money. Cheap transport means you can send your goods farther away in search of more profitable markets. Historically, that's been not only a primary means of capital generation, but also a method of making money wholly independent of government policy or whatever the new economic fad happens to be. It works with oil, grain, people, and widgets. In business terms, it's a reliable perennial. Second, if it is easy to shuttle goods and people around, goods and people will get shuttled around quite a bit. Cheap riverine transport grants loads of personal exposure to the concerns of others in the system, helping to ensure that everyone on the waterway network sees themselves as all in the same boat, often literally. That constant interaction helps a country solidify its identity and political unity in a way that no other geographic feature can. Until modern times, any particular person's world was a pretty small place. This was a simple matter of physics. The wheel eased overland travel, but carting your stuff across endless stretches of land took a lot of energy. So much energy that it was nearly unheard of for people to get their food from more than a few miles away. Anyone who spent his day lugging food wasn't spending his day growing it. Nearly all the work had to be done with muscle power, so the excess food produced per farm was very low. In the era before refrigeration and preservatives, hauling foodstuffs more than a few miles would have been an exercise in futility. Even armies didn't have much in the way of self-managed supply chains right up into the 18th century. Instead, militaries relied on the kindness, or lack of defenses, of strangers for provisions. This kept cities small, very small. In fact, up until the very beginning of the industrial era in the early 1600s, all of the global cities that we think of as epic, New York City, London, Paris, Berlin, Rome, Tokyo, Shanghai, took up less than 8 square miles. That's a square less than 3 miles on a side, about the distance that someone carrying a heavy load can cover in 2 hours, far smaller than most modern airports. If the cities had been any bigger, people wouldn't have been able to get their food home and still have sufficient time to do anything else. The surrounding farms couldn't have generated enough surplus food to keep the city from starving, even in times of peace. The same goes for civil administration. If the taxman, policeman, and garageman couldn't physically service the territory effectively, then there was no government, no services, and no ability to protect civilians from the dangers of the outside world. Those cultures that tried to grow their cities larger than this natural limit found that famine and cholera returned them to the 8 square mile size with all the speed and delicacy of, well, famine and cholera. This smallness is why it took humanity millennia to evolve into what we now think of as the modern world. Nearly all of the population had to be involved in agriculture simply to feed itself. The minority was non-sedentary peoples. History calls them barbarians, who discovered that one of the few ways to avoid needing to spend your entire day growing food was to spend your entire day stealing other people's. The only way for the farmers to survive was to have some of their own ranks become soldiers and guard against the barbarians, or become engineers to build defensive works. But those who were not farming still had to be fed. Hitting a balance that would grant both security and full bellies was difficult, if not impossible in most locations. Urbanization, which considering the era typically meant a few families building their huts near each other, was rare and temporary, and the global population remained low for eons. Historians often debate what to call this age, with some form of pre-civilized normally winning out. I refer to this age much more directly, when life sucked. Approximately 8,000 years ago, however, things started to change. Around 6000 BC, a few tribes had relocated out of the savanna of contemporary Sudan into the floodplains of the Nile. This was not a decision to be made lightly. At the time, all settlements that engaged in farming did so as a supplement to hunting and gathering, not the other way around. The savanna's wide open ranges were game-rich and offered robust supplies of fruits, nuts, and roots. The lower Nile, in contrast, flowed through the desert. The maximum width of green lands was no more than the floodplain, at most single digits in miles. And seasonal floods stripped most of the floodplain free of the sorts of mature vegetation that could support animals in numbers, humans included. After the floods, the result was a muddy, denuded moonscape, which quickly cooked into a cracked, baked plain. Turning the Nile into a breadbasket would require centuries of back-breaking labor to store water for the dry season, re-break and retill fields that would wash away in every flood season. Yet for the lower Nile's early inhabitants, all that work was worth it. The Nile provided two things nearly unique on Earth. The first was perfect agricultural inputs like reliable water and high-fertility soil. It wasn't scant desert rainfall that gave rise to the mighty Nile, but instead the seasonal torrents from the Ethiopian highlands and overflow from the African Great Lakes. The seasonal floods washed down soil of fertility far higher than what could be obtained outside the river valley. The Nile was flush with water supplies every year in a cycle so reliable that true droughts were quite literally biblical events. Perhaps more important was the second factor. The lower Nile was safe. One could stand on the ridges above the Nile floodplain at any point within 1,000 miles of the sea, look east or west, and be met with the exact same view: an endless desert waste. With the technology of transport largely limited to what you could carry yourself, it was simply impossible for any hostile force to cross the desert, which meant that it was nearly impossible for anyone, whether in the form of lions or barbarians, to reach the lower Nile. It was one of the few places in the world where there was enough water to survive and enough security to thrive. This combination of factors, high soil fertility, water supplies independent of and therefore more reliable than local rainfall, and physical security, not only provided food surpluses, but it also meant that even with a permanent guard, there was still a surplus of labor. That surplus labor could be put to use in expanding irrigation networks and generating yet more food surpluses, building an army and taking over the neighboring city and its food production capacity, building walls, generating more security and freeing up yet more labor, or for general civilizational advancements in everything from metallurgy to writing. In short, this specific type of physical geography nearly guaranteed that the Egyptians would be on the road to civilization. Over the next 2 millennia, small tribal farming settlements consolidated into a series of city-states for mutual defense and to more efficiently apply labor to the problems of taming the Nile. The higher organization and greater labor specialization led to the copper breakthrough of 3600 BC. Copper sounds like a small thing, but once humans figured out how to smelt and cast it, they replaced their wood and stone implements with metal, generating staggering improvements in the productivity of each worker and each farmer. The resulting population boom generated more and larger cities with bigger and more complex political systems. Allied city-states merged into kingdoms that then struggled for supremacy. By 3150 BC, a single government dominated all of the useful Nile territories between the Mediterranean coast and what is today the city of Aswan. The era of the mighty Egyptian pharaohs had begun. The Nile was not the only terminal desert river valley to give birth to an ancient civilization. Lower Mesopotamia and the Indus River share similar geographies and spawned similar cultures for similar reasons. Yet the Nile was the only piece of the ancient world that advanced not just in terms of technical skills such as writing and road construction, but also in terms of political organization into larger and more complex governing structures. Egypt also proved to be the longest lasting of the ancient civilizations, outliving its ancient contemporaries by 2 millennia. What explains Egypt's success? Why did Egypt consolidate while its peers remained fractured? How did it so outlast the dozens of civilizations that evolved from it? It comes back to the first principle of the balance of transport. Moving stuff is hard. Egypt. The hard part is getting there. Externally, Egypt's buffer areas were far superior to those of Mesopotamia and the Indus. The Tigris is only rarely out of sight of the Zagros Mountains, while the Tigris and Euphrates both flow from Anatolia. It may be difficult to move things about in mountainous territory, but most mountains are sufficiently high to wring moisture out of the air. Where you have rain, you can have food, agriculture even. Both Anatolia and the Zagros have housed human populations as long as human history has been recorded. As for the Indus, its upper tributaries directly abut the Ganges Valley, allowing for regular contact with that far larger river valley. Local deserts insulated both Mesopotamia and the Indus from multiple directions, but not all directions. Their geographies were secure enough to spawn civilizations, but outside forces were still able to reach them, and so they never had the time to consolidate as Egypt did. In comparison, Egypt's borders are a class apart. To the west, it is 600 miles from the western edge of the Nile Delta to where rain falls regularly enough to support a non-nomadic population, contemporary Benghazi, Libya. 600 miles of dry, hot, empty is a long thing to raid across. Land attack from the east was more likely, but that's not to say it was probable. The Sinai Peninsula is just as inhospitable as the Bible suggests, and the 300 miles between the Delta and the Jordan River Valley have proven to be a formidable barrier right up to and even into contemporary times. A southerly approach seems better, and indeed following the Nile is certainly a less painful affair than trudging through desert. But as one moves upriver south, the Nile Valley narrows to a steep canyon in places, complete with the occasional rapids locally known as cataracts. And it is a long, winding 900-mile route before you reach a geography and a climate that can support a meaningful population, contemporary Khartoum, Sudan. Establishing multiple defensive positions along the route is quite easy. In other words, you really have to want to get to Egypt. Within Egypt, however, things are very different. Within Egypt, the Nile does 2 things. First and most obviously, it makes mass food production possible. Every patch of land within sight of the river is under cultivation. generating the most consistent food surpluses of any land throughout the history of not just the ancient world, but also the classical, medieval, and even early industrial worlds. This food surplus created the world's densest population footprint for most of human history, the only exception being contemporary Bangladesh. Combine that with the country's desert buffers, and any outside influence that was not an outright invasion would be so diluted in the sheer mass of the Egyptian population that the government would have little problem retaining control. Second, by ancient standards, the interior of Egypt was remarkably easy to get around in. From Aswan downriver, the valley is flat, in the dry season turning the river into a very slow-moving lake. The lack of elevation change results in a hazy, lazy downriver ride, while Egypt's prevailing north to south winds allow for fairly reliable upriver sailing. The Nile could support riverine traffic in a way that the Tigris, Euphrates, and Indus, cursed with faster currents, less reliable seasonal flows and winds, and omnipresent sandbars, never could. The key is the difference between the ease of internal versus external transport. Just as the difficulty of external transport inhibited invasion for centuries, allowing the Egyptians to wallow in splendid isolation, the ease of transport within so facilitated governance that Egypt was able to consolidate into a single kingdom more than 5,000 years ago. For the first millennia and a half of Egyptian history, outsiders simply could not penetrate into the Egyptian core. Yet within the Nile Valley, the Egyptian government had very little trouble moving manpower, resources, the tools of governance, and even giant blocks of stone around within its riverine-based system. The many braids of the Nile combined with the flatness of the terrain to allow the narrow stretch of Egyptian civilization to be seen from the river. The pharaoh could, and often did, take a boat cruise down the river and visually inspect nearly all of his kingdom without setting foot on land. The current and accurate assessments enabled by such easy travel helped governmental policy to match and respond to reality, a concept that might not seem a major deal in a world of smartphones, but was revolutionary in the world before paper. Tax collection could reach every part of the valley, and such activity ensured that the government maintained a firm grip on every aspect of society. Food stores could be distributed quickly and easily to mitigate local famine. The population crashes and rebellions that plagued cultures well into the modern era were far less common in Egypt. Revolts could be quelled quickly because troops could be summoned with speed. Fast military transport enabled the government to nip problems in the bud. In their sequestered existence, the Egyptians thrived. Sequestered, however, is precisely the word. Just as the invaders couldn't cross the desert gaps beyond the Nile Valley, neither could the Egyptians. While everything about the river was core to the Egyptian identity, the Egyptians were never really able to expand beyond it. A grand canal dug from a western braid of the Nile allowed for the regulated flooding of the Fayum Depression, bringing another 500 square miles into Egypt's green zone. But that is the only significant expansion of Egypt's agricultural lands until the 20th century, and even that expansion was only about 20 miles west of the riverbed itself. Ventures farther abroad were almost unheard of. As the Nile flows through the desert, Egypt, ancient or otherwise, lacks trees. What few were available for boat construction were largely reserved for ego projects ranging from royal barges to monument construction. Reed boats were not just for biblical figures like Moses. Only once in the long reign of the Egyptian dynasties did Cairo make a serious effort to extend its power beyond the core Nile territories. In about 1500 BC, Thutmose I conquered the Levant up to the Hatay. But even that effort was merely a fit of pique that didn't outlive the conquering pharaoh. The sheer isolation limited Egyptian knowledge of the world. It was so thin, its leaders were shocked when confronted with the fact that some rivers flowed south. Don't be too hard on them. It was 3,500 years ago, and until their discovery of the Jordan and the Euphrates, the Egyptians had never seen another river except the north-flowing Nile. Yet while Egypt was safe on its side of the deserts, pharaonic power and Egyptian identity stopped where the irrigated land met the harshness of the desert. A line of demarcation between verdant fertility and arid sand so exact that it could be drawn with a pen. This simple dichotomy, Easy transport within, difficult transport beyond, enabled Egypt to be home to not only the first ever national identity and one of the world's largest well into the medieval period, but it also prevented it from playing a significant role on the regional stage. This differential also shaped what type of people the Egyptians would become. Every place that was within sight of the Nile was also a food-producing region, so there was never a pressing need to develop a nationwide food distribution system. That made the maritime transport system specifically, and transport in general, the province of the state. The military and the bureaucracy could move about, and did. But the common man could not and did not, firmly entrenching the concept of central control. And as we well know from history, the term common man isn't particularly accurate. Deserts, even desert floodplains, do not magically produce foodstuffs. Harnessing the river to store water for the dry season is a year-round, labor-intensive chore that requires a high degree of top-level planning and organization. Failure in central planning and organization would without fail translate into famine within months. People were rooted to the towns of their birth and tightly managed. Nor did they have options. Every town was an agricultural town, and for Egyptians to leave the Nile Valley was as difficult as it was for invaders to reach it. Theirs was a geography destined not just to generate slavery, but slavery of the masses. It was destined to generate a different sort of slavery as well. Necessity is indeed the mother of invention, and for the first age of pharaonic history, roughly 3150 to 1650 BC, there was neither necessity nor even the ability to compare notes with a neighboring civilization. Developments in agriculture, transport, and education ended with unification. Instead of generating higher and higher food surpluses, or attempting either to advance their civilization or to expand it past the confines of the Nile, the Egyptians dedicated all spare labor to monument construction. They got really good at building really big piles of rocks, but technological innovation came to a screeching halt. The mindset of eternal stability was so deeply entrenched that when ancient Egyptian scholars discovered that they had failed to account for the extra day in leap years, instead of adjusting their calendars, they decided it would be less disruptive to wait until their calendar, too short by 0.25 days annually, simply cycled all the way around again, a process that took 1,461 years. When that day arrived, the Egyptian leadership declined to make the adjustment, since from their point of view, the inaccurate calendar had triggered no deleterious events in the past millennia and a half. It wasn't until the Greeks occupied Egypt that they forced the adoption of an accurate calendar. But only in Egypt. Cultures elsewhere, even the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia and the Indus, continued to exist in a crucible. For them, existence was a struggle against famine, against nature, against each other. New technologies developed to deal with problems that Egypt was blissfully unaffected by. Writing led to literacy, copper led to bronze, spears led to swords, domesticated animals led to chariots. All of these technologies that most people associate with ancient Egypt were not actually developed there, because in Egypt there was no pressure for development past their original technologies of irrigated agriculture, basic engineering, small boats, and hieroglyphics. Even the word pharaoh was an import. In time, two of these new technologies, the domesticated camel and a sailing ship that could transport meaningful volumes of cargo, proved Egypt's undoing. Outsiders could use these techs to breach Egypt's desert buffers, and when they did, they discovered the civilization that all had assumed was mighty and impregnable was in reality languid and backward. They also discovered that Egypt's slave-heavy population lacked motivation to fight for their country. Anyone who possessed the technical skills necessary to defeat the desert was also advanced enough to conquer Egypt with almost contemptuous ease. Instead of being the greatest of the civilizations, Egypt became an easily conquerable breadbasket for anyone seeking to rule the Mediterranean basin. Once the Nile was secured, the conquering power could redirect the population from pyramid building to food production. The excess food output could be diverted out of the Nile region to fuel the conquering power's bid for Mediterranean control. At the Roman Empire's height, the capital sourced much of its wheat consumption from Egypt. The Egyptians first lost their independence in 1620 BC to the Hyksos, commonly known in the West as natives of Canaan, and then were independent only intermittently until the Roman conquest in the 1st century BC. From there, the rule of Egypt is a who's who of the ancient, medieval, and industrial eras. Greek city-states, the Persian Empire, the Great Arab Jihad, the Sublime Porte of the Ottomans, the armies of Napoleon, or the bureaucrats of the East India Company. The Egyptians never built another pyramid, and after the Roman conquest, they were not independent for a single day until the collapse of the European colonial era after World War II. All of which came to pass because transport was easy for Egyptians within their own borders, but almost impossible for them beyond.